Welcome to Cinder Crypt. Let's begin today's episode. The Statue of Liberty was never really about liberty. It rests on an 11-pointed star fort. Most visitors to the Statue of Liberty never glance at the base. They ride the ferry from Battery Park. They queue up for security. They climb the steps to the pedestal. They gaze up at the green copper figure holding the torch and the tablet, snap their photos, read the plaque about huddled masses yearning to breathe free, then board the ferry back and go home. They never look down. They never walk around the structure the statue is built upon. They never count the corners or measure the angles. And because they never look, they don't see what lies beneath their feet. They don't notice that the statue they came to admire sits atop an 11-pointed star fortification unlike anything else in the documented history of American military engineering. They don't see that the base beneath the pedestal is older than official records claim, that its geometry matches fortifications built across multiple continents in centuries before the United States existed, and that the official explanation falls apart the moment you compare it to the other structures designed by the same engineer elsewhere. The Statue of Liberty was never about freedom. It is a deliberate monument with a specific iconography, dedicated by a specific organization, intentionally placed on top of a structure whose origins have been intentionally obscured. The official story is so seamless, so well rehearsed, so universally accepted that almost no one thinks to question it. But the structure remains. The geometry hasn't changed. The stonework can be measured. The angles can be compared. And once you start looking, the cracks in the official narrative spread everywhere. They lead you to a web of similar structures across Europe and Asia, structures that textbooks insist were built in different eras, by different cultures for different reasons, yet all share the same impossible features. They lead you to a class of monumental sculpture whose imagery points back to ancient, pre-Christian symbolism that has been scrubbed from the public-facing history of the project. And eventually, they lead you to the larger question that the guardians of the official record have spent 2 centuries trying to bury. What was actually here before? Who actually built it, and why we are forbidden to ask. This is the story of the 11-pointed star at the entrance to New York Harbor, what it truly is, and why the world's most famous statue was placed on top of it. If you want more of these investigations, the kind of buried history that textbooks have spent generations trying to keep out of public conversation, subscribe right now. New videos drop every week, and we go after the questions the official record has spent centuries closing. The official version is available on any government website. The structure under the Statue of Liberty is called Fort Wood, named after Lieutenant Colonel Eleazar Wood, who died at the Battle of Fort Erie in 1814. It was built between 1808 and 1811, designed by a young Army engineer named Joseph Gilbert Totten as part of a pre-1812 coastal defense system. The site was Bedloes Island, named after a Dutch colonist who owned it in the 17th century. After the War of 1812, the fort served various minor roles through the 19th century. By the 1870s, when the French proposed giving a colossal statue to the United States, the fort had fallen into disuse. The 11-pointed star walls were already there, a convenient pedestal. The statue was placed atop them, and that, says the official record, is the whole story. Several problems arise with this account. First, the engineer. Joseph Totten is a real, well-documented figure. He graduated West Point in 1805, served in the Corps of Engineers for his entire career, eventually becoming chief engineer of the U.S. Army. He designed dozens of coastal fortifications along the eastern seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico. His work is exhaustively recorded. His designs are preserved in the National Archives. His correspondence with the War Department fills multiple volumes. And nowhere in the entire body of his documented work is there another structure even remotely like Fort Wood. Look at the forts Totten designed right after Bedloes Island. Fort Adams in Newport, started in the 1820s, is a pentagonal bastion with hornworks. Fort Monroe in Virginia, started 1819, is an irregular hexagon. Fort Macon in North Carolina, completed 1830s, is a 5-pointed star. Fort Pulaski in Georgia's 1840s is a pentagonal casemated fort. Fort Sumter in Charleston, where Totten worked extensively, is a pentagonal masonry fort. The pattern is clear. Totten designed pentagons and hexagons, straightforward bastion geometry, tailored to specific defensive functions and firing lines. His work is competent, conventional, and recognizably early 19th century American military engineering. Fort Wood is not. It's an 11-pointed star with no parallel in any other Totten design, no parallel in any other American military structure of the period, and no obvious defensive logic. Why would the same engineer who used simple pentagons everywhere else suddenly produce an 11-pointed star at Bedloes Island? Never explained, never repeated anywhere else in his career. Second problem, the masonry. Fort Wood's walls are cut granite blocks, fitted with a precision unusual for early 19th century American military construction. The corners are finished with dressed edges. The joints are tight. The stones are large, regular, and laid in courses suggesting decades of master masonry experience. American military construction before the War of 1812 was generally hurried, a young republic with a thin treasury, building quickly with local labor and materials. Those forts look functional but rough. Fort Wood does not look like the work of a rushed American republic in 1810. It looks like the product of an established European masonry tradition, the kind that produced the great star forts of the Netherlands, northern Italy, and the German principalities. The masonry is too fine for its time and place, and when you compare it directly to Totten's other projects from the same era, the contrast is immediate. His other work looks American. Fort Wood looks European, not just European, but specifically part of a fortification tradition already considered antique by 1810. Third problem, the geometry itself. 11-pointed stars are not standard military geometry. Classical bastion forts of the 17th and 18th centuries used 5, 6, 7, or 8 points. The Vauban tradition in France, which dominated European fortification design from the late 1600s onward, almost never used star geometries above 8 points because there was no defensive reason to. More points reduce each bastion's field of fire, make the perimeter harder to garrison, and complicate supply lines. From a military engineering standpoint, 11 points is irrational. It wasn't a Vauban choice, or a Cohorn choice, or a Totten choice for the reasons already given. So whose choice was it? The 11-pointed star appears frequently, however, in a different tradition entirely, the architectural symbolism of certain European secret societies, the cosmological diagrams of Renaissance Hermeticists, the floor plans of certain cathedrals, and the heraldic devices of certain ancient orders. In Western esoteric tradition, the number 11 has specific symbolic associations, the threshold between worlds, the principle of mastery. An 11-pointed star at the entrance to a major harbor is not a defensive structure. It's a symbolic statement. And the people who placed an 11-pointed star at the southern entrance to New York Harbor weren't interested in defense. They were interested in marking that entrance with a specific symbol from a specific tradition. Now the story gets larger, because Fort Wood is not unique. It's one of a class of structures found worldwide, sharing specific design features, concentrated in particular geographic zones, whose official explanations all suffer from the same problems we've identified. At Bortinge in the Netherlands, near the German border, there's a star fort officially dated to the late 16th century, but its underlying foundations have never been properly excavated, and its alignment matches Fort Wood's within a few degrees. In northern Italy, the city of Palmanova is built around a 9-pointed star with an inner 18-pointed bastion ring. In Hungary, at Komrom, There's a fortification system attributed to the Habsburgs, but its lower courses, examined directly, show stonework that predates Habsburg control by centuries. In Russia, across territories older European maps labeled Tartaria, there are dozens of star fortifications, many in remote regions, many with 11 or 12-point geometries, all officially attributed to 19th century Russian military construction, yet none have documented construction records that withstand scrutiny. In South America, the pattern repeats. Cartagena de Indias on Colombia's Caribbean coast is surrounded by star fortifications officially credited to 17th and 18th century Spanish colonial construction. But the masonry shows multiple construction periods, with lower courses in many cases predating Spanish arrival. The geometry matches the same family of designs found at Bedloes Island, northern Italy, and Central Asia. By their own colonial archives, the Spanish did not design these structures from scratch. They incorporated existing earthworks and stone foundations. The early Spanish documents describe these structures as already there when the Spanish arrived. Who built them? The Spanish never determined. The local indigenous people had no tradition of monumental stone fortification. In the words of one early Spanish military engineer, whose report survives in the Madrid archives, the structures were of a type and quality that pointed to a culture of which the local people retained no memory. This pattern, repeated across continents, is the one mainstream history doesn't want assembled in one place. Complex star forts are not a phenomenon of late medieval and early modern European engineering. They are far older and far more widespread. The named European engineers who took credit for them in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries were often inheritors, not originators. They walked into landscapes already populated with these structures, refurbished them, incorporated them into their own military plans, and wrote reports that implied they had designed them. Those reports went into archives. Archives became source material for late 19th, then 20th century historians. The original origins, openly speculated about in older travel literature, were quietly dropped from modern academic discussion. Consider what that older travel literature actually says. In the 17th and 18th centuries, before the modern academic establishment consolidated into a single coherent narrative about European architectural history, European travelers wrote candidly about what they saw. The German diplomat Adam O'Learius, traveling through Muscovy and Persia in the 1630s, described star fortifications in the Russian interior that locals attributed to a vanished civilization. He published his account in 1647. It became a bestseller, translated into multiple languages, a standard reference for over a century. The German naturalist Engelbert Kampfer, writing in 1712, described similar structures in Central Asia and made the same point. The Frenchman John Chardin, in his account of travels in Persia, described fortifications that matched no known historical construction, which local people said had always been there. These accounts together paint a consistent picture. The territory east of the Vistula and south of the Volga was, in the 17th century, dotted with monumental star fortifications of unknown origin, attributed by locals to a vanished imperial culture and recognized by European visitors as superior to anything being built in their own time. By the late 19th century, all this had been quietly written out of standard histories. The structures were reattributed to 19th century Russian military construction. The travel accounts were dropped from curricula. Local oral traditions were dismissed as folklore, and the question of what had actually been built, where, and by whom was no longer something a serious academic could discuss in public without damaging his reputation. This is the moment of the rewrite. It happened across Europe and Russia, across Asia and the Americas, in the same decades, by the same kinds of institutions, with the same consequences. The world had inherited a vast architectural patrimony. The new late 19th The century academic establishments took that patrimony and reassigned it to a much smaller, much more recent set of named engineers, none of whom had the resources, manpower, or time to have actually built what was attributed to them. The lie was never explicit. It was a lie of consistent omission, repeated until it became indistinguishable from history. And this is the context for understanding Fort Wood. The 11-pointed star at Bedloes Island is not an oddity. It is one node in a global network. The masonry, geometry, and alignment all point to the same older tradition of monumental construction found scattered across historical Tartaria, across Europe's older fortifications, across the inherited colonial defenses of Spanish America. The structure was already there when the United States took possession of Bedloes Island. The American military engineers who took credit for it in the early 19th century did what their European counterparts had been doing for 200 years. They incorporated an existing structure into a new official narrative, dated it to their own period, attached it to a named designer, and wrote it up as if built from scratch. So what was Bedloes Island before it became Fort Wood? The honest answer we don't know for certain, because early colonial records are thin and pre-colonial records don't exist. What we can say is that the island had been used and reused for various purposes for at least 2 centuries before the official fort's construction. Scattered 17th and 18th century references mention structures on the island that don't match the conventional explanation. The 11-pointed geometry fits the broader pattern of inherited star fortifications worldwide, and the choice of this specific site, with its specific geometry and alignment for the most prominent monument in the harbor, was not an accident. The men who chose the site knew what was already there. They knew its symbolic associations. They chose it precisely because of those associations. Those men were Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, the French sculptor, Édouard de Laboulaye, the French politician who originated the project, Richard Morris Hunt, the American architect who designed the pedestal, Joseph Pulitzers, who ran the fundraising campaign, and Gustave Eiffels, who designed the internal iron framework. All of them, by public lodge membership records, were Freemasons. The pedestal's cornerstone was laid on August 5, 1884, by William A. Brodie, Grand Master of Masons of New York, in a public ceremony following traditional Masonic ritual for consecrating a public structure. Corn was scattered over the cornerstone, wine poured, oil poured. The cornerstone was struck 3 times with a gavel. A copper box was placed inside, containing a copy of the Constitution, copies of New York newspapers, a donor list, and other items never fully cataloged in any public source. Hundreds of Masons in formal regalia attended. Newspapers reported it. It's a matter of public record. The statue's dedication 2 years later was similarly attended by Masonic dignitaries from across the country. The statue's official iconography, examined in detail, follows the same tradition's symbolic conventions. Bartholdi's figure of liberty is not the figure of liberty as the United States had previously imagined it. American liberty iconography in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was the figure of Columbia, a classical, robed woman, often with a Phrygian cap or sword, generally smaller in scale and more domestic in tone. Bartholdi's figure is something else colossal, wearing a 7-rayed crown, holding a torch and a tablet, facing outward to the open sea in the posture of a guardian of the gates. The closest historical parallel, by Bartholdi's own admission, was the Colossus of Rhodes, the great lighthouse of the ancient world, a colossal goddess figure at a major harbor entrance. Bartholdi's original concept had been for a different project, a colossal lighthouse at the entrance to the Suez Canal, depicting a robed Egyptian female figure holding a torch. That Egyptian project didn't proceed. He reused the design for the American project. The figure standing in New York Harbor is, in its iconographic lineage, a direct adaptation of an ancient lighthouse goddess, placed atop an 11-pointed star fort of unexplained origin, dedicated with the rituals of a specific organization. The 7-rayed crown itself is a specific iconographic choice, not a generic decorative element. In Bartholdi's tradition, it corresponded to the 7 planetary spheres of older cosmological systems, the 7 rays of older solar religions, the 7 hierarchical levels of certain initiatory traditions. The torch was the torch of illumination in the specific sense used by 18th and 19th century European Illuminist movements. The tablet, often publicly interpreted as the Tablet of the Law or the Declaration of Independence, carried older iconographic associations with tablets of esoteric law in the Hermetic tradition. None of these associations are speculative. They're documented in Bartholdi's own correspondence, the writings of his collaborators, and the published statements of the Masonic organizations involved. They're simply not part of the public-facing story told to the millions of tourists each year. Putting it all together, the Statue of Liberty was never about freedom in the sense the public has been taught. It's a specific iconographic monument from a specific symbolic tradition, dedicated with the rituals of a specific organization, deliberately placed atop an 11-pointed star fort whose origin was already obscured by the time of dedication. The public, facing meaning immigration, huddled masses. A gift from one republic to another was a layer of narrative paint over the actual symbolic content. The actual symbolic content was a marker at the entrance to one of the New World's most important harbors, in the same iconographic language used to mark major harbors in the Old World, in a tradition stretching from Mediterranean lighthouses back to ancient Eastern Mediterranean goddess figures and beyond. And the 11-pointed star at the foundation is the deepest visible layer. It was there before the statue, before the official Fort Wood narrative, before the American Republic itself in any meaningful sense. It points back to a monumental construction tradition that modern academia has collectively decided not to examine. It connects by geometry, alignment, and masonry to the network of inherited star fortifications spanning the older European empires and the territory's older maps labeled Tartaria. It is the most visible piece of evidence in the most visited harbor in the world that the story we've been told about the construction of the modern world is not supported by the physical evidence on the ground. If the 11-pointed star at Bedloes Island is part of this older inherited tradition, then the official story of New York Harbor itself begins to look different. The Dutch did not arrive in a virgin wilderness in the 17th century. The English did not inherit a blank canvas in the late 17th century. The Americans did not build a new harbor on top of nothing. They inherited, layer by layer, a landscape that had been organized and built upon by something earlier, something the official record has chosen to forget, something whose physical traces are still visible to anyone who chooses to look. The 11-pointed star is the most prominent of those traces. It sits in plain sight, photographed by millions each year, hiding in front of everyone, while the public-facing story trains every visitor to look at the statue on top, not at the structure beneath. The same pattern repeats in city after city across the Americas. The old fortifications of Boston Harbor, the structures at Alcatraz and Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, the river forts of New Orleans, the harbor defenses of Charleston, all carry the same anomalies, refined masonry out of step with the historical period, geometries that don't match standard military traditions, construction records that vanish under close examination, official explanations that collapse when physical evidence is taken seriously. Every major American harbor has its own version of the Bedloes Island story. Every major American city has its own inherited layer beneath the official colonial origin, and every official tour guide, every National Park Service brochure, every textbook chapter on early American history is part of the same project, training the public not to look down, to take the surface story at face value, to keep the older layer invisible. Take Castillo San Marcos in St. Augustine, Florida. The official record says Spanish construction began in 1672. The masonry is a local limestone called coquina, fitted with techniques that Spanish colonial archives themselves describe as exceeding their own military engineers' capabilities. The geometry is a 4-bastion star with proportions that match the older European tradition more closely than any documented Spanish design of the same period. The walls have absorbed cannonballs in 3 documented sieges, without structural failure, a performance level the Spanish found surprising, which they attributed in official correspondence to the unusual properties of the local stone. But Spanish reports in the civil archives describe the early construction phases in language consistent with incorporating pre-existing earthworks and stone foundations, not building new on a virgin site. The standard textbook account, however, presents Castillo San Marcos as a Spanish original from start to finish. Take Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, 60 miles off Key West. The official record says it's an American military construction begun in 1846, a 6-sided polygonal masonry structure with over 16 million bricks, officially never completed after nearly 30 years of work, then abandoned. The American military at that time didn't have the manpower, supply lines, or budget to have produced what's actually on that island. The bricks, masonry, engineering of casemates all point to a level of organized construction exceeding what documented American operations in the region could have achieved in the time allotted. The official explanation has stood for over a century, but the math of construction doesn't support it. The alternative, that the Americans inherited and extended an existing structure rather than building from scratch, isn't seriously considered in any mainstream account. These are the kinds of inherited layers around which the official record has been carefully edited. Once you know how to see the pattern, it becomes obvious in every major harbor and every major early American military site. But the public is not encouraged to see it. Textbooks don't invite the comparison, yet the structures remain. This is not a small thing. The largest monuments of the modern world, in the largest harbors of the modern world, have been built atop structures whose origin has been erased from the public record. The erasure wasn't subtle. It was achieved through standard 19th century academic statecraft. Reissue the textbooks, stop translating the older travel literature, reattribute inherited structures to recent named engineers, train a generation of historians to repeat the new official line, wait for witnesses to die and original archives to crumble. After a century, the lie becomes history, and actual history becomes the kind of thing only conspiracy theorists discuss. But the structures are still there. The 11-pointed star is still at the base of the most photographed statue in the world. The geometry hasn't changed. The alignment hasn't changed. The masonry can still be examined directly by anyone willing to look. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The Statue of Liberty was never about freedom. It's something older, stranger, and more specific than the public-facing narrative will ever admit. The 11-pointed star at her feet is the door, if you're willing to open it, to a much larger conversation about what was actually built in this world before the modern academic establishment decided what we were and were not allowed to remember. If this is the kind of investigation you came here for, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone willing to ask hard questions about the monuments we've been handed. And keep watching, because there's more to come. The Star Forts of the Americas are one chapter. The lost continental empire of Tartaria is another. The buried architectural record of the 19th century is another. We're working through them one at a time. And the more of us who refuse to look away, the harder it becomes for the next monument to stand on top of a structure that nobody is allowed to examine.